Hello everyone, Daniel here, and this is the third episode of this vlog series, and this time we're going to focus on, glassware, how to smell, how to taste, the basics of approaching spirits. Whether you're new or experienced, I hope this video can show you some tricks that I personally use. There's quite a lot of types of glassware out and about, and this one I'm holding up here is a chief example of an ideal nosing and tasting glass when it comes to spirits. This is a cupita, or broadly known as a cupita glass. And that's because, as far as I know, because there's so many types and you don't always know exactly what determines the style from the get-go. But from what I can observe, and having used that type of glass myself, is that it's a pretty uniform tulip-shaped glass. And why do you see so many tulip-shaped glasses when it comes to this type of nosing and tasting, contrary to wine, for instance, or beer or other alcoholic beverages? Well, spirits are like a concentrate within the world of alcoholic beverages. So when it comes to the glassware, it's very important to funnel those, bold, but also those intricate flavors and flavonoids up to the nose where they can be perceived. The problem is that not many people have them at home, so the problem can be best illustrated by the typical spirit type glassware you would have in someone's home, and that is, I think, most commonly defined by this pretty fancy looking fellow, and that is the tumbler. Perfect for cocktails, and if you watched Mad Men or other shows like that, they tend to have scotch generally, but other, cognac or brandy. A glass similar like this, where they usually put a couple of ice cubes at the bottom and they, fill up, sometimes quite generously, up to the half brim. But yeah, this is the type of glassware that you're most commonly referred to when it comes to spirits. And, as far as tasting goes, it doesn't affect it that much. The other type of glassware will mostly improve the nosing part. But you can taste a whiskey with this, but it's not ideal because the nosing and the tasting, even though we treat them as separate things, the nosing imparts on the tasting. Nosing implies flavors too, and with the retronasal relationship between the nose and the tongue, the nosing will usually impart on the tasting experience. That's why this is of importance. So sure, you can absolutely drink your favorite scotch with this, but if you have a quality single malt or a quality rum or brandy or whatever, you will soon find that this, especially if you compare it with, one friend's cupita or tulip grappa style glass, I think you will quickly see the difference yourself. But the point of this vlog is to tell you and show you. So if you want to skip that comparison, or to do too many mistakes involving this glass and waste potential quality hours with a very, very high quality spirit, so you can do it fine with this, but it's vastly inferior as far as tasting experience goes to something like this, the cupita, like I said earlier, which is a more uniform shaped glass, or you have what took the whiskey world by storm and the rest of the spirits world afterwards, and that's the Glencairn. Don't really know exactly when it was developed, but I think around the 2000s or late 90s, thereabout. It's essentially a tulip-shaped glass, but with a pretty solid glass bottom, which imparts the quality of the tumbler, which is a pretty heavy base, so you can't chuck it about when it's standing on the table. The table isn't in view of the camera, so that's why I'm illustrating in the air. But yeah, so you have that advantage. It's not too wobbly, so it's a pretty solid base, easy to hold in your hand. The only thing you have to be careful of, though, is that it's very easy to be tempted to hold it like this. And if you've seen a few wine tasting vlogs, you will have touched upon this already, but just to reiterate, in wine, spirits, beer, whatever, in alcoholic beverage tasting is generally advised not to hold the glass like this because you impart heat onto the glass and onto the beverage that's inside. And why is that a bad thing? Well, alcoholic beverages in general are most comfortable at room temperature. That is a fact. That doesn't mean that you destroy the experience by being a few degrees over or having it somewhat chilled, but it's not ideal, and that is a fact. So chilling can help, when it's, very warm in the tasting locale you're in, or if you're in a very warm country, then, sure, a big ice cube that doesn't melt quickly, or just a tiny fragment of an ice cube can help. It can, but generally, if I would do something like that, I would probably use a whiskey stone that's chilled, but never mind that. These are all alternatives, but these are a few different versions of tasting glasses that are great. You also have the grappa glass. I touched on that quickly. And what is a grappa glass? Well, it follows the same form and function, but it's a bit weirder in its shape. So instead of this uniform tulip shape, you have, with the grappa style, you might have seen it before, but you have a bulbous base and then more pointy at the top. If you don't have any of these special spirits glassware at home, don't fret, because you might have a wine goblet. Unfortunately, I don't have one right here in front of me, but most people know what a wine goblet is. It's the most basic wine glassware. And the best thing about that is it's something that is quite commonly found in most homes. Most people have, some wine drinker in the family or in their friends group. So generally in most homes you will find a classic, standard, pretty small wine goblet. And is it better than this for nosing and tasting? No, but it's much better than this. Because the main point of this design, like the Glencairn, is that you have a shape that funnels the ethanol vapors up to the nose. That is the main point. And a wine goblet, sure, it's pretty open at the top, but it still somewhat concentrates the flavors in one spot and directs the vapors somewhat up to the nose. So that makes it more ideal than a tumbler, for instance. That's it. That's enough about glassware, I think. But, it gives you the basics. You want something that has the ability to somewhat funnel these vapors up to the nose. The next part is preparing for nosing. The steps in nosing. So if we say I pour myself a spirit in this glass, the first thing that I do is that I coat. So I'm just demonstrating the movements I do. So you see I'm having it slightly on the side. And the reason I do that is so that it coats. So the liquid will come up to this point here in the glass, and I will rotate pretty calmly as to not swirl and squish it about. And this is to coat the inside of the glass. Why do I do that? Because the bigger surface area will evaporate, the spirit will evaporate successfully and oxidize. And if you do it, if you spread the surface area, there's more flavonoids that will get released and that will finally or eventually find their way up to your nose. So it spreads the surface area as to give you a more dense, let's say, plume or abundance of flavonoids that will reach your nose. So this is the first thing. So after you've spread it, there's a small instance, because it does disappear as the liquid pours down the sides. But as it does so, you'll most likely realize, depending on the quality of the spirit, but even mainstream spirits will do this, only differently. And you will start to see what, spirit aficionados and distillers call legs. These legs are due to the viscosity of the spirit, and these legs are basically small strains. They're basically droplets that form lines down the sides like this, parallel to each other. And why is it important to observe this? Well, it can give you, if you're nosing and tasting a whiskey or a rum or something that is aged in oak barrels, it gives you an indication. It's not necessarily super precise, but it gives you an indication of how old it might be. and in general, just the viscosity. The more a spirit is aged, the more oak spices and flavonoids and, you know, flavor compounds and sugars it gets when resting in an oak barrel, depending on the oak type, the previous contents, it will gain viscosity. Just by maturing itself, it will gain some form of viscosity. So that's why it's a pretty good indicator of age, although not entirely precise, as there's more variables involved than just time. Like I said, previous contents, oak type, if it's in stainless steel, all that stuff. All that will impart the viscosity bit. But basically, you can make an observation on the viscosity by the thickness of the leg. So if it's a pretty broad line that goes down or drop, or if it's thin. And then you have the speed at which it reaches back to the bottom. That is the main indicator of the viscosity. So if you have pretty fat legs that take time to come down, odds are that the age of the product or the length of the maturation is considerable compared to something that drips down pretty rapidly. So if it's an unaged product, generally the legs, they might be thick, but they will generally tend to come down pretty quick. So that is one observation you can do, you know, while you're preparing to nosing. And what do I say prepare to nosing? Well, when you have a mix of spirits, some might be unaged and some might be aged. When it's unaged, as a general rule, whether aged or unaged, it's always good to let it rest for a little time. It is generally unadvisable to just, you know, dive in straight away, first second you pour it. You can do that. I mean, it's not going to ruin anything, but you're not going to see the best of your product. That's it. That's mainly why people bang on, well, people like us. Well, we bang on about, you know, taking your time and waiting. I think it's more enjoyable. Like, why rush something that's supposed to be enjoyable, hey? So that's one thing. But then there is the science bit of it, and that is alcohol or spirits as a solution is not just ethanol. It's not pure ethanol. It's purer than, of course, beer or wine, but there's still a good amount of water in there. That's where the percentage comes in. But then you have all these fatty acids and all these chemical binders that, you know, bind these flavonoids together or within them, and singular flavonoids. And all of these things, they don't usually unravel, you know, immediately like that, because it's an unhomogeneous mixture. Spirits, that is. Ethanol and water are not, they're not a homogeneous mixture, meaning they don't want to marry. They need to be courted in basic speak, you know, unchemical, non-chemistry, scientific speak. So in order for these things to express themselves, they need a little time, generally speaking. If you have an unaged product in the glass, sure, you can be a bit more bold. You don't have to wait too long before you get stuck in. But generally, even with unaged spirits, everything included, it's good to wait a solid minute before you start assessing with your nose. And when you do, what I personally do, especially when it's something that might be cast strength or, you know, high proof, is to approach it, not to get stuck in right away, like we said with the time stamp thing, with the weight. Here, it's also good to be a little bit patient. So alcohol, especially if you're not used to ethanol, because usually for those that aren't used to it, what is the general reaction you have to smelling it? Ooh, you know, it's strong. It will repulse you somewhat. And one way to get over that is to approach it slowly. This will not, even if you abide to these techniques in here, it doesn't mean that that alcoholic sting will disappear straight away. All this does is ease your way into it. Because there is an element of experience here. You know, I'm not pretending that this instruction video will be perfect, but even if you watch the most perfectly composited or structured how-to video on this, it will take time before you acclimate your palate and your senses to spirits. They are strong. We are not naturally equipped to deal with them straight away. Most people like me that love them, work with them, we have come to this point through experience. Very important. And that experience is not just finding out all the different glassware and all that. That helps. That is why I'm doing this video. But I also really want to bang on the point that experience is an unescapable ingredient in all of this. Some people are quick learners. They will get into it more rapidly or get through the wall, as I like to say. The ethanol will sometimes act as a barrier where you have all these flavors that are locked within or locked behind. And if you're new, that wall will not only be intimidating to pass, but you will find that it's like a door. It acts like a door where you have to acclimate to it in order to find all the treasures within. So when you've done these preparation steps, you've observed and all that stuff, all that is optional. I mean, if you're just tasting for your pleasure, analyzing it might not be necessary, but these are just steps before you get to the nosing. And then, like I said, nosing, start further away and then approach as necessary. And when you start to get near the wall, to take that metaphor once more, that's usually that pretty narrow sweet spot you will find when you're new. That can be a bit difficult, but try and find that sweet spot anyway, because that's where you might find these flavors that you can at least detect before that ethanol intensity starts burning your nose or tingle your nose. So when it starts to tingle, then you just pull back, try it again, pull back, try again, pull back. And if you start getting nose fatigue is when the intensity of the alcohol and or the flavors within start to make your nose less perceptible. It starts to dumb your nose down. You will start to feel that I'm not perceiving these subtle, interesting aromas when I first put my nose in. Then it can be good to just take a little break, neutralize your senses. This is one classic tip, and that is, well, only if you haven't put a lot of cologne or perfume, which I advise you not to do if you're planning to taste anyway. But sniffing your wrist like this, unperfumed, neutralizes or acts like a neutralizing agent for your nosing. Coffee beans is another solution for that, but you don't usually have those lying around. But if you're a coffee head, you might have them. So there you go. That's another use for them. So we've done glasses, we've done nosing techniques and all that stuff. There's also retronasal technique, and this is, for those who have generally taken the first steps. I generally advise newbies to stay away from this. But if you've already done this a few times, then retronasal basically means that when you nose, you have your mouth slightly open, and that is to create an opening between your nose and your mouth, so you get this retronasal style of nosing going. And that is, you get the fumes in here, and having the mouth open permits the vapors to get out again, and it permits you to almost taste the nosing in a sense. What it mainly does is also relieve your nose somewhat, so you can really get stuck into the heavier and lighter and more extreme flavors for longer, basically, and perceive them more clearly. So it's more of a technique, to warm up to down the line. It's not necessary when you start off, because usually you have products that don't really require that, but it can still make a difference. So when you feel ready, you can incorporate that one as well. So after you've nosed, and we will get to the tasting part of it, which is a really fun bit, to be honest. And when you taste something, there's a difference between the mainstream spirits that tend to be around the 80 proof if you're American, or 40% ABV, which is a standard strength for, I think, most spirits, all categories included. And with those spirits, it's fairly easy. You can always experiment with a drop of water, but the water for diluting is not really necessary. I think you might have heard from whiskey aficionados or rum aficionados that you can put some water in it to to dilute it, to get more out of it. And when it comes to the mainstream 40%ers, yeah, it's most likely at 40% because, well, either for commercial reasons, because they wanted more money out from the casks, out from the product itself, out from that batch, or because, the producers felt like, yeah, this was the best sweet spot for the flavor profile they were going for, or how they felt it was more marketable. So generally at 40%, it's a pretty low point for, as far as sweet spots go, for most spirits. I personally think it's a bit low, but if you have a mainstream spirit and if you're new, it's very well adapted to that scenario. So if you have 40%, don't think too much about watering it down. If you do, you're welcome to it, but just add a few drops. That's it. And what that will do, whether it's 40% or 50 plus cask strength, one drop or a couple of drops, a minimal amount, will help to separate the fatty oils and the oils that are incorporated in the alcohol water mixture. They will then come up to the surface where they will make the spirit the most expressive. So if you're an experienced drinker and you have a 50 somewhat percent cask strength version and you want it at its biggest, boldest, most intensive, generally you will put a couple of drops in there, or even one drop, and that will be enough to create that initial separation that will actually make it even more intense. So if you look at it as a graph, basically, of intensity, when adding water, the graph goes slightly up before then just continuously going down as you gradually dilute it. So the first drops will make it the most intensive, and then it will gradually become less and less and less and less, and change and evolve, especially if it's a quality non-reduced product. Then you will see quite a big change from most intensive to least intensive. And then you usually have several sweet spots there within. That's why the aficionados go for the cask strength non-reduced versions, because they generally have these fatty oils that have all these wonderful flavors in them. And by doing this progression, you taste all the different facets of a very complex product. With a 40%er, mainstream one, the experience is more ready-made. So you might see some changes with time oxidization, just leaving it with, a lid on it. I don't have a lid here, but here's the camera lens lid. So putting it on there like this, leaving it with a measured oxidization will change the product. So that's one thing you can do if you have a 40% mainstream product. Just put a drop of water in, put a lid, and come back to it after 20, 30 minutes, 1 hour, That is a good thing to try and do if you have, a pretty mainstream standard single malt or rum. So when you start to taste it, when you actually get to the tasting, I advise to take a small sip, because, it will numb you, especially if you're new to spirits. Spirits or high concentrated alcoholic beverages have a stinging or numbing effect on the tongue and the mouth. So this you need to think about, even if you're experienced, because that's simple chemistry, and biology, basically. It has that numbing effect, and you need to counteract that by taking a smaller sip. It will be less of a handful. You'll be able to more precisely discern the flavors, and you won't numb your mouth immediately. So it has a lesser numbing effect, but you still need enough to discern the flavors. So taking a micro sip is pretty useless, because it will easily get diluted by the saliva in your mouth. So I recommend taking a sip that is big enough to cover your tongue, but not big enough for it to, numb the whole interior of your mouth. So enough to coat the tongue is a good starting position when it comes to the amount you're supposed to sip. So when you sip, generally you let it sit on the tongue, and you can also swirl it around. And here it's a bit of a, it's a variable when it comes to different sommeliers and experts and reviewers and producers. Some swirl it around quite aggressively, like some wine tasters. Generally, though, aggressive swirling or washing about generally isn't that beneficial, but once it's in your mouth, you can be a bit more aggressive with it. I've tried several different methods myself, and you know, swishing it about in your mouth, it can help depending on the type of spirit you have. So I would say have your own method, but try different things. Try different things with different spirits. You know, we're all built slightly differently, and so are these products as well. So when it comes to the swishing method, as a starter, I recommend just gently swish it around in your mouth. Not too aggressively, but just enough to get it going, get it moving with your saliva, get it on your tongue, and try and do it after it has rested on your tongue. It's always best to let it assert itself calmly first, and then you can start to move things around. It's a good starting point, at least. So then, if we say that we have something stronger than 40% and you want to add water, a good indicator is to, even if you don't want that super intense, oil separation starting step, by adding a couple of drops of water, I still recommend you do this. Just if you want to take the edge off, you can always take a sip of water beforehand to soften the blow, so to speak. But when you've done that, if you skip that part or not, be very careful when adding water, because when the water is added, it can't be taken away. So some might think, ooh, I've over diluted my whiskey or my rum or my whatever. Let's say you have a 45% spirit. You want to mellow it out a little bit, but you added too much, and you taste it, and it tastes watered down. You've passed the point of dilution where some of the flavonoids are diluted out of the final solution, being your freshly diluted liquid. Some might think, well, I'll just add a bit of the non-diluted whiskey, rum, whatever. It doesn't work like that, because what you will have is just a blend of the non-diluted version and the overly diluted versions, and that will not equate to a midway between the two. That's not how it works. When it's diluted, that's its new state of being. And it can be a bit different if it's bigger volume spirits. So in the production cycle, if you have a big vat and you happen to over dilute it, if you have another vat with less diluted spirit of the same type, if you act quickly, you can counteract it. But since the quantity in your glass is so small, the reaction happens way quicker, which is why when you're diluting your whiskey, rum, cognac, easy does it, step by step, which is why many experts have a pipette. It's not to be snobby, it's because you want to add bit by bit. A will give you a better experience, but even if you feel like, no, but I know this spirit, I know that the sweet spot is around 2 teaspoons-ish of water. I mean, I've done it myself out of laziness by just aiming for that sweet spot. If I know where that sweet spot is and I don't want the whole journey, that specific session. But be very careful, because when you go over, you can't go back. I've done that mistake several times, so I'm just telling you, it's better that way. And if you don't know the spirit, if you're new, odds are you don't know that whiskey, rum, whatever, so why not take the journey? You can do more of a speed run if you will, but like I said, be careful, because if you overstep your mark, that's it. You won't be able to reverse out of it. So carefully add water, please. So with all that said, I hope this was informative, fairly unchaotic. I have a tendency for that. But yeah, I hope you find stuff that's helpful that you might have seen elsewhere, but hopefully this helps you on your way to either perfecting or just getting started with your nosing and tasting experience. So with all that said, thank you for watching, and see you in episode 4, the next one. Bye.